In this video, I will be analyzing Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare. And this is generally considered one of the, or probably the most famous sonnet in the English language. And it begins with a summer's day. So I've given you a painting here by Albert Bierstadt of a summer's day. And who am I? So I am Evan Mantyk. I'm a teacher of history and English literature. I also run the Society of Classical Poets. I'm the president and editor. So let's get to now. Actually, before we jump into the sonnet, we are going to look at some history or some background as to who is this sonnet talking about. So to get some context, it seems we don't know with certainty actually who this sonnet is talking about. Who is Shakespeare addressing this to? But from the history, we can kind of get an idea that it's about a nobleman or his son or a family of nobles. So he was addressing it to the upper classes of England. Probably a specific one. They think the Earl of Southampton and his son. So it was somebody like this. So I've given you some pictures here. That's a king and that's a nobleman there. And the first 17 of Shakespeare's sonnets are actually addressed to what seems to be a young man, encouraging him to get married and to have children, and that when he has children, this will kind of give him immortality. But Sonnet 18 does something different. And it seems more general. So he probably either it was for himself to read, or he was contributing it to some lord or noble's court or a king's court, and it could be read to anyone as a kind of general song of praise. But it's not. We have no reason to believe that it's really romantic or intimate in nature. It's really more of a feeling of admiration and respect for somebody great. And so I've given you a few pictures here, and also here the summer's day, just to keep in mind. And I will give you the text now. You can see. So this is Sonnet 18, and I've given you some translation of the more difficult words here. And I'll just go ahead and read it, and then we'll talk about it in more detail. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So, what is this poem saying? It's a sonnet, which means it's usually a 14-line poem. It's written in iambic pentameter. So that means you have 5 iambs, which is an unstressed and then stressed beat, which comes out to usually around 10 syllables, not always, per line. And so what is he saying? Okay, so if you're having difficulty, we'll go through it line by line. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Should I compare you to a summer's day? It's crazy by ordinary modern standard to compare a person to a day in the summer. It doesn't make sense. But this is the kind of magic of poetry, that you're able to do this kind of comparison. So I'm going to compare you to a summer's day. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Lovely is just wonderful, and temperate. Today people might say cool. So you're more wonderful. You're cooler than a summer's day. You're better than a summer's day, right? Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. So May is when we usually have spring in the north, and we have these beautiful buds and blossoms. However, as the seasons progress, we get to the heat, and those buds, well, they end up falling off. So all those beautiful spring blossoms and buds are now kind of getting blown off by the winds of summer. Okay, so summer's not that great, it turns out, right? Not as great as you. And summer's lease hath all too short a date. And summer is not that long. You end up pretty soon you're in autumn and winter, and of course that's not very nice. It's kind of cold. So another reason you're better than summer. Sometime too hot, the eye of heaven shines. So what is the eye of heaven? This is just the sun, right? Beaming down, the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. So now that's referring to the sun. Of course, this is actually my own understanding. I should note that. You could probably interpret a lot of these lines in different ways, but I'm going to give you my interpretation. Um, so this line and the previous line seem to be talking about heaven the sun, and specifically they seem to be personifying it. And when you personify, you turn something into a person. You give it person-like qualities, even though it isn't usually thought of as in that way. So here the sun seems to be personified. It has a face, a complexion or face of gold. And it has eyes, right, or at least an eye. And every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course, untrimmed. And fair means beauty, as you can see. So over the course of the season, we start out with some very beautiful bushes and trees and flowers. But over the course of the year, if you just watch those, um, inevitably they go from really beautiful to kind of overgrown, or they get just damaged by a rainstorm or somebody walks on them or who knows what. So that's the chance something bad could happen to them, or just in nature's changing course, they just overgrow, they die. Somebody else, a bunch of weeds come. So anything can happen, and that's nature's changing course, and they could just be untrimmed. Right? Nobody comes along pruning them and making sure they're beautiful. Okay, so just again, summer is of course summer's a good thing usually, but it has some bad sides, and it's not as good as you, who I am praising, right? In some court, some royal or noble court. So you are wonderful. Um, but thy eternal summer shall not fade. Right? So somehow you have an eternal this summer, and it's like immortal. It's everlasting. Nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. So summer is gonna kind of die and turn to winter, but your beauty is not going to die. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. So here we can see death personified, and there's a big clue too, because death is capitalized. So death, in other words, death doesn't have you. He doesn't have you in his grip. He doesn't have you in his, literally they're saying in his shade, so like close to him. But it means that death doesn't have you because, well, we'll have to read on to see why. But again, the summer is going to die, but you are not going to die, is what it's saying. When in eternal lines to time thou growest. Now, what are these lines? Let's keep going. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So again, what are these lines, and what is this? And perhaps there are different interpretations, but the most obvious one would be this sonnet. So these lines that Mr. Shakespeare is writing, when in eternal lines to time thou growest, are these 14 lines of this sonnet. And so long as this sonnet exists, as it does now, and we are reading it, it will give you life, and you will live on in this sonnet. And unlike the season that's going to die each year, this sonnet will live on. And that's kind of the power of art, right? The amazing power is it can live on way past any kind of living thing normally, right? So that seems to be what this ending is about. So as long as there are men who can breathe and who have eyes and they can see it and read it, this sonnet will live on. Okay? So that's the general idea of this poem. Um, and so the summer is great, of course, but you are even greater, and summer has all these downsides, which you do not have because you are going to live on in this poetry that I am writing, this sonnet. So that's a kind of in a nutshell what this seems to be saying. But there are other things going on here. Why is this such a great poem? That almost it seems kind of uh, interesting, but maybe not that amazing. But there are other historical things going on here, which I'm going to try and elaborate on for you. This is the historical context of Sonnet 18. And why is it important to look at historical context in the first place? Historical context can be very important in understanding things. It can also be what elevates something to the level of greatness. Okay, and we can see this in movies actually. Um, so here, I'll show you. These are of the top 6 highest grossing movies, and this is adjusted for inflation. Um, the 4 of those top 6 are all essentially historical fiction. They're based on some history or something that's believed to be real history, and then kind of uh, elaborated on to create a story. So it connects very immediately to the history of our civilization, of humankind, right? So with Gone with the Wind, it's the Civil War. The Sound of Music is World War II. Titanic is obviously the sinking of the Titanic. The Ten Commandments is believed to be the history of the Jews and the Christians after them. So all connected to that, right? The civilization. Um, and so these histories kind of elevate these works. If they had perhaps no historical connection, I would argue they definitely would not have been as popular as they were. If they just made up something, they would not be these great works that people love even to this day and return to years later, right? So it's this historical context. So I would argue that it's extremely important. So what is the historical context then of our Sonnet 18? Well, to understand it, we need to go way, way back to Western civilization reaching its cultural and political peak during the Roman Empire. This is a kind of imagining, actually, in the 19th century. This painting here by Thomas Cole. But it gives you this idea. It's just beautiful and wonderful. It's kind of heavenly kind of place, it seems. Everything clean and orderly, and also kind of celebratory and beautiful pageantry. And you can see here the map. So this is when the Roman Empire reached its height. It was just massive, probably bigger than the EU, although I'm not exactly sure of that. But it was certainly comparable, an enormous empire, bigger than any of those single countries today, which is very impressive. And so it was this time that this Roman civilization built on top of the Greek civilization was created the wonder and greatness of the ancient times, antiquity, in the Western civilization. But of course, it reached its peak, and then just like a kind of a human being, eventually it kind of degenerated and fell apart. Um, and that's supposed to be Rome, that great city there, and then eventually it's invaded by vandals and barbarians coming in and destroying it, and probably for there was reasons behind it. The people grew degenerate. They had all kind of degenerate things that they were doing, and their general philosophy and morality had declined. They had become weak, effeminate, um, girly, basically. The men were cowardly and weak, and they had all kind of sexual deviation that was going on, and certainly those things will weaken your armies, if nothing else, and the morality will decline, and generally things just fall apart. And this is just typical of any great civilization after a while. So, okay, so this great Roman Empire and the Greek civilization it built on top of kind of declines, and it basically collapses. And you can see this reflected in the arts. So the art now also declines. And so that is a beautiful Greek. So I'm kind of lumping the Greek and the Romans together here in the antiquity. And you can see how exquisite the detail is there on the left in this stone carving. But now if we look at a stone carving on the right, we can see how much it's pretty good. I mean, it's kind of cartoonish though, and extremely simple compared to the one on the left. And the proportions are obviously messed up in the bodies and the hands, particularly the feet, unless these are supposed to be like hobbits or something. Um, and so you can see the quality is gone down. And in general, in the Middle Ages, particularly the Dark Ages now, the kind of first half of the Middle Ages, there's no more big cities. The great arts have declined. They can't create those great things anymore. Um, Generally, people are less well educated. You have kings now who can't read. So the people who have the most political power in the Roman Empire, they could always read, and they were powerful and they had influence. Now you would have kings in the medieval times, and many of them couldn't even read. So things change significantly. Um, Now with the Renaissance, so after there's about 1,000 years we call the Middle Ages, roughly speaking, and it kind of goes down, but the civilization gradually builds up to a point where it matches and even surpasses ancient times. And so you can see a stone carving here that is extremely exquisite and incredibly realistic and lifelike, proportional. Um, and it's now about 1500. So we're 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, which was around 500 AD. Now we're around 1500 AD. This is all kind of rough numbers, but it gives you the general idea. The Renaissance, the word Renaissance literally means rebirth. So this is the rebirth of culture. Okay, so we're coming back to the great culture, and we're even surpassing it. So that's the idea of the Renaissance. And this is when our sonnet is written, during the Renaissance, right around that time. Okay? Um, and part of the Renaissance is humanism, this idea of humanism. Now, if you say you're humanist today, um, that means you're kind of atheist and socialist and communist even. Um, but the Renaissance human was quite different. It was a movement which emphasized human potential, human achievement, and the greatness of human beings as closest to God. So it was very spiritual and was very much connected to the divine. But it was saying how awesome human beings are to achieve these great things, to surpass those great ancient Romans and Greeks, because they saw some of the things they built and they knew they were awesome. But finally, they've achieved what they achieved, and they've even gone beyond it. They built even bigger domes in their architecture. They made even better paintings. They made even better sculptures. So they said we're awesome, but they also had an understanding that they were awesome because they were in the image of God. They were the creatures closest to God. They were not equal to God. They were still inferior to God, but they were the closest among all the creatures on the earth, and they had this kind of ability to become closest and most like the divine. They have this inherently kind of divine spark in their nature. And you can see this very well in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. It's a giant painting. I only gave you a piece of it here. And this is in Vatican City in Rome. Um, and you can see that the picture of Adam, so this is God on the right creating Adam, the first man, according to the Western traditions in Judaism and Christianity. And you can see that it's like parallel. You could almost take the picture of Adam and flip it and elevate it slightly, and it would be very much in the same position as God. Not exactly, but similar. Um, and you can see, if you look very closely, that there's just this tiny little space between their fingers here. And so this shows just how close humans are to God. And humans are great because of this closeness. Okay? So today is kind of a reason to think that God is really nothing significant when people say humanism. But back then, it was still very much spiritual and believing in God and not atheist at all. It's kind of like humans are great because of God, because they have this connection, this close connection to God. Um, so when you're looking at Renaissance poetry, okay, you essentially just can start with the phrase humans are amazing or humans are great because. So what is this sonnet saying? Humans are great, humans are amazing because, and then you kind of fill in the blank. And here you can see humans are amazing because a human can be even greater than a summer's day. A summer's day is this giant thing that everybody experiences and it's wonderful. But a human being can be even greater. Okay? So that's one reason. Um, why else? A human can also write poetry. So you can see the second half of the sonnet gets into how a person can be greater. They have this connection to art, specifically poetry, but you could extrapolate it to all art, like dancing and music. Um, so humans can create those kind of things, paintings that would last for forever or for thousands of years, and will transcend their lifetimes, right? Um, so humans are great because they can do this. So this is another reason because humans can create poetry that lasts forever. So this is another way that we see the Renaissance reflected here. Okay, you can also see it in the kind of divine language, the choice of words, eye of heaven. So heaven is the spiritual place, right? Not necessarily the sky, but a kind of spiritual place where gods and divine beings exist. So we have this eye of heaven. The choice of words here makes you think of something closer to God. And the fact that death is personified is something traditional from religion. Often God is a god, Hades, or someone like that, or Satan, or the devil. Or they have different images of death with the scythe, and the skeleton face. So this is something very common in religion to have kind of death personified, at least traditionally. So you can see for all these reasons, this is a Renaissance poem. And it kind of captures that feeling of the Renaissance and that amazing history. And it's all in here, and it's using it to praise someone, to do something positive in theory. So that, in a nutshell, is a brief explanation of it, and also kind of an elaboration on the historical context and the bigger things that are going on behind the great Sonnet 18 of William Shakespeare.